So good afternoon. My name is Igor Blazevic. I'm the head teacher at the very small educational non-government organizations in Myanmar called Educational Initiatives. So we are now in an extraordinarily beautiful library of the Anglo-American University, and it's my real pleasure to be together with Alexei, Anisin. Thank you very much for inviting us here. We are here to talk about the dynamic of the relations between the mass protests and the reaction of the security forces, military forces.
Yeah, thank you for coming, and I'm delighted to be here.
So let's start with really kind of some of the basic terminology. How do you will define what is the end game?
Yeah, I'll get to that. I want to just also thank you for this opportunity. It is an extraordinary situation in the country under attention and in the world. An endgame situation is where you have a government or an incumbent regime that is pinned against an opposition. It is the last point at which a struggle tends to manifest. It's a point at which there's been protests for many months, and it's a situation in which last-minute decisions get made, and often revolution either succeeds or fails during this time period. And in Myanmar, I think that is what we are currently witnessing.
Then the next question will be, if we are talking about shifting the loyalty of the security forces, how you will describe what is the soft defection and what is the hard defection?
Yeah, so this is a definition that was made in a recent study by Croissant and colleagues, and it is not a universally utilized definition, but a soft form of defection is when security forces would simply not respond to an order to repress protesters, or they would stay in their barracks. A hard form of defection is the launching of a coup, and in Myanmar we saw that in February of this year. So there already has been a hard form of defection, and you now have this military-led government, and new opportunities for soft forms of defection can arise. And I think recent weeks we've seen soft forms of defections already starting to occur.
Will it be possible to give some concrete example of the end game in which we have a mass protests and then the shift of the loyalty of the military forces happened? How it happened, why it happened?
Well, I'll start close to home here. 1989, Czechoslovakia. In face of mass protests, the military went out on television and said, "We're not responding to these protests with threat." That protest was very large. 500,000 people were out here on the streets of Prague. More recently, I mean, we've had the second People Power revolution in the Philippines. That was one incident, and in general, this phenomenon happens during the end game situation. The drawback is that on a general level, there's still very little conclusive evidence about why it actually happens then, right? Because you have large numbers of cases in which it happened and other cases in which it did not happen. So it's a difficult thing to predict, and I would say it's an incredibly difficult thing to predict.
And what about, but we can probably, let's say, talk about certain factors which we have identified that are usually playing in the game.
Sure.
So what are these kind of the five complex setup factors which are contributing to that?
In my personal inquiry on these topics, utilizing data from hundreds of years in total of opposition activity, I found that the size of the opposition movement was important. So 100,000 or more people was one of the variables, both violent and non-violent strategy, perhaps exclusively or non-exclusively. State bureaucratic defection, so when members of the government walk out on the government and join the protesters. Repression backfire, in cases in which you have protesters get repressed and the incident doesn't stop protest, that could lead to defection. And in my own research, I've found that it's combinations of these different factors that can bring about the outcome of defection. Now, perhaps the way in which my research differs from kind of prior work was that prior work tended to only view nonviolence as one of these kind of sufficient factors that needs to be in place alongside other factors to bring about the outcome. But I found that it's not necessarily the case. For example, I identified 5 different pathways through which defections occurred across around 800 years in total of opposition activity from the years 1946 to 2006, cross-national data. And 3 of these 5 solutions featured the condition of violent protest strategy. So we know that defection can arise under nonviolent and violent circumstances. My hypothesis for future inquiry is that it's probably a mixture of both that has the highest likelihood of spurring the outcome.
It seems to me that in your study you have made very, very interesting unpackaging of the concept of the nonviolent civic resistance by making a distinctions between the strictly nonviolent civic resistance and mass civic protests, which include elements of the unarmed violence. Can you a little bit explain us what is the difference and what is the specifically unarmed violence?
Sure. So fully nonviolent resistance is when no forms of violence are utilized at all. So not even like harmful blockades. This is essentially occupations and marches, sit-ins. In contrast to unarmed violence can be what scholars refer to as sticks and stones, right? So there are some forms of violence, but they're still unarmed, which brings us to the ultimate category of violent resistance, where that has the featuring of guns and knives, explosives, etc. So in my research, I emphasize that it's important to specify which of these strategies are going on in a given campaign. And from my recent inquiry, I think that combinations of all of these strategies, of the two, not all, but of unarmed violence and full nonviolence, the usage of both of those, I think, may be the most historically effective in bringing about major social change.
And in your research, you have came with a certain percentages. Let's say, my data set is showing me that this amount of the purely nonviolent has been successful. This percentages of. Yeah. So what are the percentages?
Well, this was from a study that was published around a year ago, and I'll read it off here just because it's a lot of percentages. And it was data on revolutionary opposition movements from the year 1800 till the year 2006, so 206 years of opposition activity. And I found that nonviolent campaigns were successful 48% of the time. So almost half. So fully nonviolent campaigns were 48% successful. Campaigns that adopted unarmed violence were 61% successful, while fully violent campaigns were 30% successful. Mm-hmm. So those numbers contradict previous research, which basically said nonviolent campaigns were around 60% successful and violent campaigns were around 30%, right? I included this additional measure of unarmed violence, and I found that form of strategy is actually the most successful. Mm-hmm. There's different mechanisms behind why I think that may be so, but I won't get into them just now.
In Myanmar, we have a very complex situation. Basically, we have attempted military coup, which has not succeeded to consolidate the power. We have already prolonged 8 months long, very nationwide protest, which from the beginning, during the first 4 months, has been strictly nonviolent. And this nonviolent movement is still continuing now in the 8th months. But in meantime, as a reaction on the violence of the military, people started also to apply the unarmed violent tactics. And now in the last months also they started to resort to the armed resistance. So it's a very complex. Is there any similar case somewhere else in the world?
That's a fantastic question, because you literally do have the whole portfolio of strategies here. And I think one important element to consider here is that challenging a military-run government is different than a civilian-run government. And with all these strategies being used, potentially the recent case of Sudan might be a parallel, but to be honest, I'm not an expert in that country, but from history, that's all I can really see in at least recent history. And again, challenging a military-led government is different than a civilian, because usually the civilian-led government has to rely on a military to protect it. Whereas now the military is the government, right? I mean, I know in the country under attention, there's around 80 to 90,000 police officers as well, but the armed forces are huge. One of the largest armed forces in Asia, right? Like 300, 400,000 people. So that's a massive structure of security.
And in your research, have you in any moment analyzed and researched the kind of active tactics which protest movements are doing to basically stimulate the loyalty shift of the security forces or defection of the security forces? And if you have done some research on that, let's say, what are the usual tactics in a repertoire?
Yeah, sure. Well, beginning with one of the most historically prominent factors or processes, and this actually has not happened in Myanmar, but it is repression backfire. So in some historical revolutions, a military would just massacre civilians, and after that, the government would just fall. People would get outraged, the military would stop doing their job, almost more than a majority. But on a more pragmatic note, if you look to contexts such as Turkey or Myanmar, right, a repertoire would be simply fraternization, right? So protesters in their interactions with security forces would attempt to convince them to question their loyalty. In some historical revolutions, like in Ukraine in 2003 and 4, I believe, protesters in the opposition movement offered the military better working conditions and higher pay if they were to end up overthrowing the government. And if there is a unified organizational structure in an opposition movement which is hierarchical and there's leadership, the leadership can literally pose programs to potential defectors and offer them protection. I think that already has happened in Myanmar. It happened in Iran in 1978 and 79. Opposition movements even, the opposition movement back then even sheltered and led security forces to escape, provided them routes to do so. So there's a range of tactics. None of them are guaranteed to succeed, and it is the job of scholars to find out when and why they are successful.
And it's even more task of the people on the ground in the protest movement to invent different things. The next question is, your data set, if I'm right, which you have been using for your research, has been going till the 2006. Some of the scholars doing the similar research of the defections in the army and nonviolent protests, let's say, have expanded it a little bit to 2014. My question is, can we already now say that after the 2010, after the 2011, or after the 2014, we have basically entered into the new era almost, in which we have a very weak West, we have a very, very assertive and opportunistic Putin ready to support the regimes at any costs. We have a China playing its global role in protecting authoritarian regimes. We have a regional power like Saudi Arabia, the Turkey jumping into the geopolitical. And it seems that there are, let's say, all these kind of the geopolitical changings are also significantly changing the conditions in which the protests are happening and the regimes are calculating, let's say, what are their options. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, I think the rise of a multipolar world order in the last 10 years has been incredibly significant for determining what happens on the ground in subnational contexts. One major scholarly trend now is the topic of democratic backsliding. And this process, I think, has really picked up in the last 10 years. Countries that were ranked at a certain level in their democratic institution functioning are tending to rank worse year in and year out. And combined with the rise of China and then the resurgence of Russia, at least militarily, I think you do have a qualitatively different set of conditions in today's protest struggles than you did before. Not only for these massive geopolitical shifts, but also in terms of communication technology, digital technology. When social media first arose, there was a lot of scientific papers published that were quite idealist, saying that, well, protesters now will be able to utilize this and overthrow governments because they have such a powerful medium of communication. But as time has gone on, I think governments have been more effective in shutting down communication through digital technology than protesters have been in utilizing it to overthrow governments. And it's likely because governments control, in most countries, electrical grids. They can create power outages. They can shut down the internet overnight. There's so many different strategies. So different era, different tools, and different preferences.
In the last I say couple of years, or maybe even a little bit longer, we really had examples of the extraordinary strong civic resistance, popular movements. We can think about case of the Venezuela, of the Turkey, of the Syria at the beginning, or Hong Kong more recently. And in all these cases, at the end of the day, the regimes crack down the protests in which kind of the hundreds of thousands, in some cases even millions of the people, let's say, participated. So we might be needed to talk about certain additional resilience of the regimes. Do you have some explanations why the regimes are today more resilient than they used to be before?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. It's one that's on the mind of many people, both activists and scholars. And I think if we situate it within this literature of democratic backsliding and the rise of authoritarianism, perhaps elites that are in control of governments are less likely to give into pro-democratic concessions than they were in the past. For example, in 1989 and from 89 to 91, in this part of the world, in anti-communist revolutions, many elites agreed to give concessions. In countries like Hungary or Bulgaria, they sat down at the table with the armed forces and the opposition. It was a change in their mind. So I think this anti-democratic mind shift that's been going on in the last 10 or so years, and it continues to intensify, could be why governments are less likely to concede to pro-democratic opposition. But then there's also another explanation, and the answers probably lie somewhere in between. I also think that perhaps democracy and associated ideological platforms may have run their course, their historical course. We saw that with communism. Communism started to not be as popular. People stopped believing in it. Perhaps opposition movements need to articulate a new ideological platform. We kind of already see that in places like Germany, where now there's like platforms of climate governance, and that's fundamentally different than what came before. So it could be the case that, again, one hand you have elites less likely to offer concessions because they perceive that there's this anti-democratic global wave. They have support from big players like China and Russia. But then you also could have a deficiency in the need for activists to articulate new ideological platforms. And I would cite here Ernesto Laclau, who was a prominent discourse theorist, and he would always talk about the need to articulate a new idea of a people and to include symbols in there to incorporate, like, for example, both intellectuals and the working class, that politics is not a static foundation, that a new form of hegemony needs to be articulated in some historical periods. And I think perhaps we are at that period. And I don't want to end with this, but I want to say there's no one that was more wrong than Fukuyama, right? Because what we've seen is that history has not ended. Instead, it's just been reinvigorated.
Would you kind of dare to think about following lines that one of the reasons why authoritarian regimes might be more resilient, in addition to all the things that you have mentioned, is also that basically kind of the what became politically and economically viable options for the regimes is these kind of oligarchic systems which are surrounded by the security apparatus, and they don't need the people because they have this kleptocratic globalized world in which they can let's say nicely prosper and have the resources, and that this is basically, let's say, now their goals are not ideological anymore. They don't need to care for the people because the globalized kleptocratic system is basically enabling them to have all the benefits and very little kind of the harm. So is that overstretched from our side?
No, I think that there is truth to that observation. I think, especially from an international development perspective, the last 30 years, especially 20 years, the rise of China has flipped economic theory upside down, because it was never believed that an authoritarian state could achieve such high rates of economic growth and prosperity for such a large amount of time. So that's also in the mind of leaders, that there's no like this Bretton Woods system of governance and these IMF and World Bank packages that have institutional changes attached to them. Countries are starting to realize, well, we don't need to make those changes. We could just have, for example, China come in and build our highways and develop in the Chinese model. That's one aspect. Another aspect, and I think I'd cite here more of a literary or philosophical theme, and if you have ever read Dostoevsky's Demons, which is a book about revolution in 19th century Russia, and there's an interesting set of statements in there, and he basically postulated kind of an ontology of revolution, that if there's a decline in religion and people are not believing in a theistic power, then they're going to try to make some kind of godlike power on earth. And perhaps with the global decline in religion, and I'm just talking here, my subjective opinion, global decline in theistic belief, especially in the West, perhaps people are doing all they can to create regimes on earth and shifting greater attention into preserving these regimes, even if they're autocratic. I mean, you look at places like North Korea or even contemporary China. What difference is there in the supreme leader versus a theistic deity? Very, very little.
Just for with the two more questions to come back, let's say, to the question of the defections, and you are in the middle of the struggle. So basically, your profound, as a protest movement, your profound aim is to stimulate the defection and to give in a certain way certain promises, certain concessions in order to get the military on your side. In which way they can negatively influence your future prospects? To basically have a high quality democracy, or not to have, let's say, military or security forces back after a couple of years. So can you elaborate a little bit about that? How much you lose your future quality of the democracy if you are making promises and bringing military during the struggle on your side?
Sure, I think it has to do with institutions and the institutional configurations that get set up, all about taxation. If there's resource wealth, which we know in Myanmar, there's immense natural resources. If that issue is not dealt with, meaning that if those security forces in the future rely on some kind of external form of income, or that their income is being driven by non-taxable forms, then that relationship between them and the people is likelier to deteriorate because their preferences aren't aligned. It's an institutional configuration that needs to result in equilibrium. In 17th century England, which was a context where you had the first country and having a king loses divine right to rule, there you had a king cede partial power to a parliament, and that parliament started taxing people. And that's a very important dynamic, because governmental revenue would then be based on taxation, and security forces would get taxed. But again, each case needs to be qualitatively researched. You need to know where armed forces are getting paid from. I know that something we haven't mentioned when we talked about China and Russia, but from my understanding, both China and Russia have a big arms deals contract with the Myanmar army.
Yeah, they have Russia less. Let's say Russia is now, let's say, entering into the field, using the opportunity. China is playing much more complex game, let's say, because they don't want instability. They don't want also to have a soft power influence, so they don't want fully to back the coup. But on the other side, they are afraid of the people's power. So China is playing a very, very complicated role. I know that the scholars don't like to make the predictions. They like to make analysis based on things what happen and the data and facts which they have. But still, let me ask you the question: what you will say? What are the three for the protest movement which is facing the military regime and trying to stimulate the defections? What are the three things to do, and what are the three no-nos? Don't do that ever.
It sounds like I need to write a paper about that, because it's something I can't answer off the top of my head, but I'll do my best. The three things that need to be done: first, the opposition needs to have an organizational structure, preferably hierarchical, with a certain set of leaders that can at any time become the leader of the movement. That leader needs to be good at negotiating and needs to essentially be a populist figure. A second thing would be, again, to make guarantees to the potential defectors of a better life after a revolution. And a third dynamic would be addressing the topic of pay and the institutional structure behind how armed forces get paid if there is to be a new government. Three no-nos. They're really difficult here. I think, again, having a non-hierarchical movement in which there's no particular leader will put you in a disadvantage, because it'll be harder to come up with deals and programs. You have to have significant political actors that are willing to essentially put their lives at risk. Another dynamic would be to not directly engage in conflict in early stages of the movement, right? You want to kind of try different things and see how the situation pans out. And the third and final factor, again, would be don't always rely on external international communities, because we've seen many instances where the international community does support a movement, for example, Venezuela, but it may not result in success. So be open-minded, and there's not much else to say. It's a difficult question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think some of things what you responded is really kind of, in a certain way, very, very relevant for colleagues in Myanmar. Maybe just one additional kind of sub-question is, you have mentioned kind of the giving the promises, giving the incentives to the military. On the other side, let's say when you are in the middle of the struggle and that military is committing atrocities against the civilian population, so it's politically very, very hard to make the promises in a moment, let's say, when your people want them to be punished. Let's say, do you have any ideas how to balance these two things?
I think it would have to do with discourse and ideas about morality, because if an opposition movement is to articulate a new form of hegemony, like Ernesto Laclau frequently talked about, it would need to feature some kind of ideas about the people. If the incumbent government or security forces are slaughtering and massacring people, there's an issue about what they perceive to be the people. And I'm not saying that new ideas from the opposition could change that, but it would be a step in the right direction. Some kind of moral dynamic would have to come into play. And I know that morality is more of a political philosophy concept that's talked about in normative ways in scholarship, but it is, I think, empirically in the real world, it is very important. There has to be a line drawn about shared meanings, understandings, historical legacies, what's right and what's wrong.
Alexei, it has been a real pleasure to talk with you. I learned a lot. I think my audience will learn a lot. So it was really a very big pleasure. Thank you very much for giving us the time.